The day Sadie Chandler's barn roof caved in under the weight of 3 feet of unseasonable April snow, she stood in the wreckage with her jaw set like iron and told herself she would fix it herself or die trying, which, given the state of her finances and her stubbornness, seemed like equally likely outcomes. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges of limestone and cedar, the kind of place that looked almost pretty from a distance and revealed its hardships only when you were standing square in the middle of them. The main street had a general store, a livery, a small church with a listing steeple, a doctor's office, and the Dusty Bell Saloon, which did considerably more business than the church on any given Sunday. The surrounding land was ranching country, flat in stretches, and then suddenly broken by ravines and creek beds, the grass still pale from winter and only beginning to show the first hints of green. Sadie had come to Harlow Creek 2 years prior with her husband, Thomas Chandler, who had bought a 40-acre plot west of town with money borrowed from his uncle in San Antonio. Thomas had been a dreamer, the kind of man who had big hands and even bigger ideas, and for a while the ideas had seemed like they might be enough. They had built a small house together, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, and they had started a modest cattle operation with 12 head and a horse named Douglas. Then, in the October of 1881, Thomas had been thrown from Douglas during a freak thunderstorm, had hit his head on a limestone rock, and had never woken up. He was 29 years old. Sadie was 26. The neighbors had come with food and condolences, and the pastor had said all the right words over Thomas's grave at the edge of the east pasture, and then everyone had gone back to their own lives and their own struggles, because that was the nature of things in Harlow Creek. The land did not care about grief. The cattle still needed feeding. The bills still came. Sadie had sold 10 of the 12 head to cover what was owed on the land and on the house, and she had kept 2 cows, a young bull she called Franklin, Douglas the horse who she refused to sell out of some combination of loyalty and spite, and 40 acres that were now entirely hers. She had taken on laundry work for 3 families in town and had started a small kitchen garden that she expanded each season. She was, by every measure available, surviving. She told herself this was enough. She told herself this every single morning while she hauled water from the creek, every evening while she mended clothes by lamplight, and every night when the house was quiet and the loneliness pressed against the walls like something trying to get in. And then April came with its freak snowstorm, and the barn roof came down, and Sadie stood in the ruins of the structure that housed her 2 cows and her bull and her horse, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost funny, that the universe had a very poor sense of humor. She had already moved the animals to the lean-to and to the small fenced pasture before the roof gave way, so at least there was that. But the barn itself, the walls still standing but the roof entirely collapsed in the center, was going to need to be rebuilt, and she had $32.14 to her name and a pile of wet, splintered lumber that used to be her roof. It was while she was standing in the ruins, cataloging what could be salvaged, that she first properly met Roscoe Wells. She had seen him around Harlow Creek. He was hard not to notice. He was tall, built the way working men were built, all lean muscle and broad shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that ran through the valley floor. He wore a battered brown hat that had seen better decades, and he had a way of moving that was unhurried but deliberate, like a man who had learned that rushing things rarely improved them. He was 29 years old, and he worked a ranch about 3 miles to the northeast of Sadie's property, a larger spread owned by a man named Holt Drummond. He was the foreman there, a position he had held for 4 years. On the morning after the storm, Roscoe had ridden out to check the fence line between Drummond's land and Sadie's 40 acres, which had a history of needing repair after any significant weather. He had seen the barn roof from a 1/4 mile away, a sagging, broken line against the pale sky where before there had been a clean slope. He had slowed his horse, a sturdy gray named Calvin, and he had looked at the damage for a moment, and then he had turned and ridden toward it. Sadie heard the hooves and straightened up from where she had been crouching over a section of timber. She pushed her hair back from her face, a dark red-brown that she kept in a long braid, and she watched him approach with the kind of expression that a woman develops after a year and a half of managing entirely alone, which was to say, polite and closed and not particularly inviting. "Mrs. Chandler," Roscoe said, pulling Calvin to a stop at the edge of the wreckage. He took his hat off, which she noted as a courtesy. "Mr. Wells," she said. She had spoken to him perhaps 4 times in her life. He had always been civil. He looked at the collapsed roof and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You need help with that." It was not a question. It came out flat and observational, like a man noting that the sky was a particular shade of gray. "I have it handled," Sadie said. Roscoe looked at her. Then he looked at the roof again. Then he looked back at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite pity, because pity was the thing she most despised, but something more like recognition. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the center joist is cracked through. You cannot fix that alone." "I appreciate your concern," Sadie said, which was what she said when she did not want to be rude but also did not want to continue a conversation. Roscoe turned his hat over in his hands once, settled it back on his head and said, "I'll be back Saturday with some timber. Drummond's got a surplus after he rebuilt his equipment shed last fall." "I did not ask for that," Sadie said, and her voice had an edge to it now. "No," Roscoe agreed. "You didn't." And he turned Calvin around and rode back toward the fence line. And Sadie stood in the ruins of her barn and felt a confusing mixture of irritation and something she absolutely refused to examine further. Saturday came and Roscoe came with it, arriving in the mid-morning with a wagon loaded with good pine timber, a spare set of tools, and a young ranch hand named Pete who was 17 and seemed to find the entire enterprise very exciting. Sadie came out of the house when she heard the wagon, and she stood on her small porch with her arms crossed, and she said, "Mr. Wells, I told you I had it handled." "Yes, ma'am," Roscoe said, climbing down from the wagon without looking at her. "I remember that." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her then, and there was a steadiness in his dark eyes that was entirely disarming. "Because the timber was just sitting in Drummond's yard and your cows are sleeping in your lean-to, and it seemed like a waste to leave it there when it could be useful here." Sadie opened her mouth and then closed it. She could not, in good conscience, argue with that logic without sounding entirely unreasonable. "I will pay you back," she said, "for the timber." "No need," Roscoe said, and moved to the back of the wagon to start unloading. "There is every need," Sadie said, sharply enough that he paused and looked at her again. "Fine," he said after a moment. "We'll talk about that later." They did not talk about it later, because Sadie spent the morning bringing them water and food from the house, which was her way of contributing, and because watching Roscoe Wells' work was somewhat distracting. He knew what he was doing with timber. He and Pete worked with the ease of men who had built and repaired structures before, and by the afternoon the old collapsed section had been cleared, and the new joists were going in, and the barn was beginning to look like a barn again. Sadie found herself leaning in the doorway of the house more than once, not watching, she told herself, just keeping an eye on the progress. At one point Pete, who was young and had not yet learned the value of discretion, said loudly to Roscoe, "She's real pretty, Mrs. Chandler." There was a brief silence. Then Roscoe said, in a voice pitched low but not quite low enough, "Yes, she is. Nail that board." Sadie went back inside the house and did not come out for 20 minutes, during which time she made coffee and tried very hard not to think about anything at all. When the day's work was done and the roof was not yet finished, but was substantially more finished than it had been that morning, Roscoe and Pete climbed back on the wagon. Sadie came out with a plate of biscuits and salt pork wrapped in cloth and said, "For the road." Because she may have been proud, but she was not ungrateful, and there was a difference, and she knew the difference even if she sometimes had trouble showing it. Roscoe took the package and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Chandler," and then he said, "We'll be back next Saturday to finish it." "You don't have to do that," Sadie said. "I know," he said, and he drove away. He came back the following Saturday, without Pete this time, and he finished the roof while Sadie worked in her kitchen garden 20 yards away, pulling the last of the dead winter growth and turning the soil for planting. She did not ask for help with the garden. He did not offer any. But at midday she brought him a plate of beans and cornbread and set it on the fence rail, and he ate it without ceremony and said it was the best beans he'd had in recent memory. She said he was being polite. He said he was not given to politeness for its own sake. She looked at him for a moment and then went back to her garden. The roof was finished by 4 in the afternoon. It was a good roof, solid and properly joisted, better in fact than the original had been. Sadie walked through the barn and ran her hand along the new timber, and felt the weight of something she could not name sitting in her chest. She went to find him where he was loading his tools into his saddlebag, and she said, "Mr. Wells." He turned. "I want to pay you for your time. I have been thinking on it, and I can manage $5, and I will give you more when I am able." Roscoe looked at her for a long moment. There was something careful in his expression, something that was working through several possible responses. "Mrs. Chandler," he said finally, "the timber was spare. The time was mine to spend as I chose. I chose to spend it here. That does not mean I should not compensate you," Sadie said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm not going to take your money." He paused, and then he said something that surprised her. "I would take as an invitation to Sunday supper if you were of a mind to extend one." Sadie looked at him. She was quiet for a beat that stretched longer than was entirely comfortable. "That is a different kind of payment," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral. "It's not payment," Roscoe said. "It's just supper." A pause. "I can bring something, whatever you need." "I don't need you to bring anything," Sadie said, and then she heard herself and almost laughed despite herself. "I will cook." "Sunday then," Roscoe said, and he got on Calvin and rode off toward the northeast, and Sadie watched him go and then looked at her new barn roof against the late afternoon sky and thought that life was a very strange and complicated business. She spent most of Sunday morning arguing with herself about whether the invitation had been a mistake. She was a widow, and she was independent, and she was not, she told herself firmly, in need of company or complication. She had enough to manage without adding a cowboy to the list. She cooked a pot roast with onions and the last of her winter potatoes, and she made a pan of cornbread, and she set her small table with the 2 chairs she had, and she told herself it was just a meal between neighbors and meant nothing beyond that. Roscoe arrived exactly when she would have expected a punctual man to arrive, just before noon, with his hat in his hand and a jar of preserved peaches that his landlady at the boarding house in town had sent along. Sadie accepted the peaches with something that was almost grace and said the table was ready. They ate across from each other, and the conversation, which she had expected to be awkward, was not. Roscoe was not, she discovered, a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, and she had grown comfortable with silence, so the moments when neither of them spoke did not feel oppressive. When he did speak, it was worth hearing. He asked about her cattle and listened when she answered. He asked about the kitchen garden and seemed genuinely interested in her answer about companion planting, which she had read about in a farming almanac. He told her about a creek-fed meadow on Drummond's eastern boundary that got good spring grass, and mentioned that she was welcome to bring her cattle to graze the edge of it in lean seasons. He said it matter-of-factly, not as an offer of charity, just as information about the land. She asked him where he was from. He said he had grown up in Kansas, outside Wichita, the son of a cattle driver who had spent more time on the trail than at home. He said it without bitterness, just as fact. She asked how he had ended up in Harlow Creek. He said he had followed work south and then found that Harlow Creek suited him, that there was something about the valley that made him want to stay. She asked him if he had family. He said his mother had died when he was 12, and his father had died on a drive when he was 20, and that he had a younger sister named Clara who had married a schoolteacher in Abilene and seemed very happy. She told him about growing up in East Texas, in a town called Mercer's Crossing, and about her father who had been a blacksmith and her mother who had kept a spectacular garden, and about Thomas, because Thomas was part of her story and she was not the kind of woman who avoided her own story. She said Thomas had been a good man and a kind husband, and that she missed him, and Roscoe listened to that without flinching or trying to redirect, which she appreciated. After the meal she gave him coffee and they sat on the small porch in the afternoon light, and Roscoe watched her cattle in the pasture and said, "That bull of yours is going to be something when he fills out." "I know," Sadie said. "Franklin's got good lines. You name all your animals. The one's worth knowing," she said, and Roscoe smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it did something unexpected to the steadiness she had been maintaining for an hour and a half. He left before sunset, thanked her for the meal, said the pot roast was exceptional, and rode off, and Sadie sat on her porch for a while after he had gone and listened to the evening sounds and thought about things she had not thought about in a long time. He came back the following Sunday. She had not invited him, but she had not invited him either, and when she saw Calvin coming down the ridge road at mid-morning, she found that she was not surprised, and that the thing she felt was not annoyance. She had cooked enough for two. This became the pattern of their spring. Roscoe would find some small reason to come by during the week, checking on the fence line, bringing a post he had extra of, asking about grazing arrangements with a formality that was transparently an excuse, and on Sundays he came to supper. Sadie told herself she tolerated this because it was practical, because the fence did need occasional attention, and because his knowledge of the land and cattle was genuinely useful. She told herself this with less and less conviction, as March gave way to April and April to May. In May, the creek that ran through the eastern edge of her property flooded after 2 weeks of rain, cutting off the access road to town and soaking the lower pasture where she kept her cows. She spent 2 days moving the cattle to higher ground and digging drainage channels, and on the third day, when the water was still high and she had not been able to get to town for supplies, she found herself completely out of cornmeal and coffee and was down to her last can of beans. She stood in her kitchen and looked at her empty shelves and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been managing alone for too long, and she thought about riding to town through the flooded road, which was possible but dangerous, and she thought about asking one of the neighbors to bring supplies when they came through, which would require asking, and asking was not a thing she did easily. She was still thinking about it when Roscoe arrived, not on Calvin this time but in his wagon, which was loaded with enough supplies to last her 2 weeks. Cornmeal, coffee, salt, a slab of bacon, dried beans, 2 pounds of sugar, and a bottle of medicine for cattle that he said was useful when the ground was wet this long. He set it all on her porch and said, "Creek's supposed to drop by Thursday." Sadie looked at the supplies and then at him. "I did not ask for this," she said. "No," he said, "I know that. I was managing." "I know that too." She was quiet. The thing that was fighting inside her, the pride that had kept her going through 18 months of difficulty, and the part of her that recognized kindness when it came without strings, settled into an uneasy standoff. "You keep doing things I haven't asked for," she said, and her voice had gone soft in spite of herself. "I keep finding things that need doing," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. There was something in his expression that was entirely honest, and she found honesty more difficult to refuse than almost anything else. "Roscoe," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both heard it. "Sadie," he said, equally quiet. They stood there on her porch with the sound of the creek running high somewhere in the trees, and something shifted between them, some fundamental rearrangement of what they were to each other, quiet and irrevocable as water finding a new channel. "You should stay for supper," she said, "if you have time." He had time. They cooked together that evening, or rather Sadie cooked and Roscoe sliced the bacon and watched the cornbread, and they moved around her small kitchen with a natural ease that surprised her. There was a moment when they both reached for the salt at the same time, and his hand covered hers for a brief instant, just a second, and they both went very still. Sadie looked up at him and he was looking down at her, and the distance between them was not very much at all. She stepped back first. "Salt's on your side," she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Right," he said, and he was not quite steady, she noticed, and that was somehow better. Supper was good and the conversation was easy and warm, and when he left that night he stood at the door and turned back and said, "The creek should be down by Thursday, like I said. But if you need anything before then, I can be here in an hour." "I will not need anything," she said firmly. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "I know, but the offer stands." She watched him ride off into the dark with her arms wrapped around herself against the night air, and she thought, with a certainty that was both terrifying and somehow freeing, that she was in serious danger of falling in love with Roscoe Wells. The creek dropped on Wednesday and Sadie went to town on Thursday, and the first person she ran into on the main street of Harlow Creek was a woman named Florence Garland, who was the wife of the town banker and made it her business to know everything about everyone. Florence was not a malicious woman, but she was an incurably curious one, and she stopped Sadie outside the general store and said, with the particular brightness of someone delivering interesting news, that she had heard Roscoe Wells had been spending a good deal of time out at the Chandler property. "He has been kind enough to help with some repairs," Sadie said evenly. Of course," Florence said, nodding in a way that suggested she found this a very incomplete explanation. "He's a fine man, Roscoe Wells, very steady, very decent. You could do a great deal worse, Sadie, for what that's worth." "I'm not looking to do anything at all," Sadie said. Florence smiled the smile of someone who does not believe this for a moment, and said she hoped Sadie would come to the church social the following Friday. And Sadie said she would try, and escaped into the general store before any more observations could be made. Inside the store, picking up her order of thread and lamp oil, she was served by old Walt Brody, who ran the place, and he mentioned casually that Roscoe Wells had put in a credit account for her the previous week, in case she needed anything while the road was flooded. Sadie went completely still. "He did what?" she said. Walt Brody looked mildly alarmed. "He said you might need supplies and couldn't get through. He wanted to make sure you had credit if you sent word. I thought you knew, Mrs. Chandler." Sadie paid for her things with the money she had brought, made it very clear to Walt that she would be paying for her own purchases and that the credit account could be closed, thanked him with a politeness that was under considerable strain, and walked to her wagon with a very specific kind of anger building in her chest. She went to find Roscoe at Drummond's ranch, because she was not the kind of woman who let things sit. Drummond's spread was well maintained, a large main house, several outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, and good fencing that went on for what seemed like miles. She found Roscoe near the horse corral, working with a young horse that was testing its manners, and he looked up when he heard her wagon, and something changed in his expression from focus to caution in the space of half a second. She climbed down from the wagon and walked straight to him with her shoulders squared, and she said, "You set up a credit account for me at Brody's." "I did," he said. He did not look away. "Without telling me." "Without telling you," he agreed. "Roscoe," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite anger because it was more complicated than anger. "I am not a charity case. I am not a woman who cannot provide for herself. I have been managing this property for a year and a half without anyone's money, and I do not need you treating me like I cannot fend for myself." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words with care. "No," he said, "you're not a charity case. You're the most capable person I know, man or woman. That account wasn't because I thought you couldn't manage. It was because the road was flooded and I was worried, and I didn't know how else to help when I wasn't sure you'd let me." That knocked the edge off her anger just slightly. She pressed on anyway. "It is not your place to worry about me in that way." "Maybe not," he said, "but I do." Silence. The young horse blew breath through its nose and shifted. Sadie looked at Roscoe, and Roscoe looked at Sadie, and the afternoon light came down flat and gold over the corral fence. "I will pay back what you put on that account," she said. "I didn't put anything on it. It was just credit. Then it can just be closed." "All right," he said. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, because having gotten through the confrontation she had been rehearsing for the past 2 hours, she found herself uncertain of what came next. "Why do you keep doing this?" she said, and her voice had gone quieter. "Every time I turn around, you're there, fixing something or bringing something or making sure I have what I need. What is it that you want, Roscoe?" He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. "I think you know the answer to that," he said. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable. "Say it plainly," she said, because she was a woman who preferred plain things. "I want to court you," he said, "if you'll allow it, properly. I'm not trying to take anything from you, or tell you what you need, or make you into someone who has to depend on me. I just want the right to come by and bring supper sometimes instead of you always cooking it, and sit on that porch with you in the evenings, and be honest about the fact that I think you are one of the most remarkable women I have ever met." He paused. "I know you've got your independence, and I'm not asking you to give any of it up. I'm asking to be part of things. That's all." Sadie was quiet for what felt to both of them like a very long time. A crow called somewhere out past the fence line. The horse shifted again. "You cannot set up credit accounts without telling me," she said. "I understand that now," he said. "And when I say I have something handled, you need to trust me when I say it." "I will try my best," he said honestly. "I won't always succeed. I have a tendency to act when I see something that needs doing." "I noticed," she said dryly, and he smiled, and she felt that smile somewhere in her chest. "You can come for supper Sunday," she said. "We will see how things go." He nodded, and there was a warmth in his expression that was carefully contained but unmistakable. "Sunday," he said. She drove home and tried very hard not to smile the whole way, and mostly failed. The courtship was, like both of the people involved in it, a little unconventional and entirely genuine. Roscoe came for Sunday supper and brought things now: a smoked ham 1 week, a sack of flour the next, and he would not accept Sadie's objections to this because he said if he was going to sit at her table every week he was going to contribute to it, and she could take that or leave it. She took it, on the condition that he stopped trying to sneak other things past her. He agreed to the condition and kept approximately 60% of it. On a warm evening in mid-June, they went riding together, down the long creek bottom where the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the water ran clear and shallow over the white limestone. Roscoe rode Calvin and Sadie rode Douglas, and they rode side by side with the evening light slanting through the trees, and at one point Douglas pushed his nose against Calvin's neck and Roscoe said, "Our horses like each other," and Sadie said, "They have good judgment." And they both looked at each other at the same moment and laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from the same place as crying, from somewhere deep and unguarded, and after it faded they rode in a comfortable quiet that felt like coming home. He told her things about himself on those rides and on those Sunday evenings, slowly and honestly, the way a careful man opens up when he has decided to trust. He told her that he had wanted to ranch his own land since he was a boy, that he had been saving toward it for years, that he had nearly had enough. He told her about the loneliness of being a foreman, how you were neither fully one of the hands nor one of the owners, how he had spent a lot of years feeling like he was somewhere between where he wanted to be and where he was. He told her about a woman he had come close to marrying 6 years ago, a woman named Ruth in Dodge City, who had decided the uncertainty of his life was too much for her, and how he had understood that, but how it had taken a while to not be lonely afterward. Sadie told him things in return, because his honesty made it easier to be honest. She told him about the fear she had felt when Thomas died, not grief alone but a raw, animal fear of the future, and how she had decided to transform the fear into action because there was nothing else to do with it. She told him that she had cried exactly once since Thomas's death, one full night in November about 3 months after it happened, and had not allowed herself to cry since, and that she was not sure this had been entirely healthy, but that it had kept her functioning. She told him that the hardest thing about being alone was not the work or the money, but the fact that there was no one to tell the small things to. The calf that was born funny, the moment the first spring flowers came up in her garden, the sunset that looked like the sky was on fire. She had learned to hold those moments alone, and they were still beautiful, but they were sharper-edged for being unshared. Roscoe listened to this and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You can tell me the small things." She looked at him sideways in the evening light and said, "I already do." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him, and they rode back to her property in the long summer dusk with their hands linked across the gap, and it was the most natural thing in the world. They had their first real disagreement in July, and it was about the upper fence line, which had a significant section that was failing, and which Sadie had been intending to repair with posts she had ordered from a mill in the next county. Roscoe had noticed the failing section on one of his rides and had quietly gone ahead and fixed it one afternoon while Sadie was in town for her laundry work. She came home to find the fence repaired and Roscoe's tools still leaning against the post, and she felt the anger flare up hot and quick even though she knew it was a gift, because the point was that she had a plan and he had overridden it without asking. She waited for him to come by the next morning, which he did, and she said, "I had ordered posts. I had a plan for fixing that fence." "I know," Roscoe said. "I saw the new posts stacked by the barn. Then why did you fix it?" He rubbed the back of his neck and looked like a man who knew he had made the same mistake he had promised to try to stop making. "Because 3 of your steers were pushing at that section, and if it had come down tonight you'd have had cattle on Drummond's land by morning, and Drummond's foreman, which is to say me, would have had to deal with it from both sides, and it seemed simpler to just fix the fence." Sadie looked at him. The anger flickered. "You could have told me," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I should have, you're right. I know I'm right." "I know you know," he said, and there was a faint, contrite smile at the corner of his mouth, and she tried to hold onto her irritation and found it slipping. "The posts I ordered are still good timber," she said. "I'll use them to reinforce the south gate, which is also going to need attention before winter." She pointed a finger at him. "Ask me first." "I'll ask you first," he said. They were better after that, more careful with each other's boundaries, more honest about what they needed. He learned to check with her before doing things, and she learned to tell him when she needed help instead of letting a problem grow until it was crisis-sized. These were not easy lessons for either of them, but they were learning them together. In August, a man arrived in Harlow Creek that changed the shape of things. His name was Boyd Crane, and he was a land agent from a firm in Austin that had been buying up properties in several counties across central Texas. He was smooth-spoken and well-dressed, and he knew the value of flattery, and he began making the rounds of the smaller landowners in and around Harlow Creek with an offer that was, on its face, generous. He came to Sadie's property on a Tuesday morning when Roscoe was at Drummond's and she was alone, and he sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee she had given him out of manners, and he laid out a number on a piece of paper that was more money than Sadie had seen in one place since Thomas's life insurance had paid out. The land was valuable, he explained, because there was talk of a rail spur coming through the valley, and if that spur came through, property values in the area would rise considerably. But the deal he was offering now was certain money, today money, and the rail spur was still speculation. He had bought land from 11 other property owners in the county over the past 6 months, he said. Good people, all of them, who had taken the certain money over the uncertain future. Sadie listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and her expression revealing nothing. She thanked him for coming, told him she would consider the offer, and showed him out. She stood at her window after his wagon pulled away and looked at her 40 acres, the garden, the barn with its new roof, Franklin in the pasture, Douglas in his stall, the grave at the edge of the east field where Thomas was buried, and she thought about that number on the piece of paper. She told Roscoe about it the following Sunday, and his reaction was careful. He asked her what she thought. She said she was not sure. He asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted to keep the land. He nodded and said then she should keep it. She said it was not that simple. He said he knew and asked her what would help her keep it. She had thought about this. She said, if the rail spur does come through and if I can hold on until it does, the land will be worth twice what he's offering. But I need to be able to sustain in the meantime, and I'm close but not there yet. Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been saving to buy land. I have enough now to buy 20 acres, maybe a bit more, depending on the price. If you were willing to sell me the north 20 acres at a fair price, you'd have capital to operate and you'd still have your house and your pasture and your garden and Franklin and the grave site. Sadie looked at him steadily. You want to buy part of my land? I want to buy land, he said. I've been wanting to do it for years. Your north 20 is good land, Sadie, and it connects to the creek bottom. I'd be a fair neighbor, she said. You have been planning this. Not planning, he said. Thinking, there's a difference. He paused. It would help us both, but I want to be clear that I'm not doing it as charity. I want the land, that's true, independently of everything else. It took her a week to decide. She consulted the deed and the plat map, and she rode the north boundary 3 times, and she talked to Walt Brody, who had some knowledge of land prices in the county, and she decided that Roscoe's offer was fair. She also decided privately that the fact that it was Roscoe buying it was something she was not entirely neutral about, that the idea of his land next to hers, sharing a fence line, felt right in a way that she was no longer in the business of pretending not to notice. They made the arrangement in September, with Walt Brody as a witness and a handwritten contract that they both signed at the kitchen table. Roscoe paid her in cash that he had saved in a box under his bunk at Drummond's for 4 years, the same cash he had been adding to, a little at a time, since he was 25. He spread it on the table and they counted it together, and it was exactly right. When the money was counted and the paper was signed and they were both sitting across the table from each other in the quiet kitchen, Sadie looked at the signed document for a moment and then looked up at him. You are now officially my neighbor, she said. I have been unofficially for some time, he said. Yes, she admitted. You have. He was still looking at her with that steady, warm expression, and she was tired of pretending she did not feel what she felt, because it was taking up considerable energy that she could apply elsewhere. Roscoe, she said. Sadie. I am not an easy woman, she said. I have a great deal of pride, and I am not particularly good at accepting help gracefully, and I have opinions about nearly everything, and I am unlikely to change any of this substantially. I know, he said. I wouldn't want you to, and I will not apologize for it. I wouldn't ask you to. She was quiet for a moment. I think I love you, she said. I want you to know that, not as a thing I'm saying to get anything from you or because you bought 20 acres of my land, as a plain fact. Roscoe was very still for a moment, and then something in his face opened up in a way she had not seen before, something that had been carefully contained for months. He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood up too, and he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her chest ache, and he said, I have loved you since I watched you standing in the ruins of your barn in 2 feet of snow telling me you had it handled. She laughed, and it was the unguarded kind. That was the first day you met me properly. I know, he said. I'm thorough. She kissed him. He kissed her back, and it was everything that patience and honesty and 2 people who were both a little bit difficult and entirely worth knowing can produce when they finally stop holding back, which is to say it was extraordinary. There was a good deal of happiness in the months that followed, and also a good deal of ordinary work, because happiness in the real world does not suspend the practical requirements of life, and both of them were people who understood this. Roscoe left Drummond's employ in October, having given proper notice and parted on good terms, and he began working his 20 acres in earnest. He built himself a house on the property in the fall, a real structure, 2 rooms and a good stone fireplace, with wood he had hauled himself. He slept in Brody's boarding house in town while he built it, and he came to Sadie's most evenings and on Sundays, and they talked about the land and the cattle and the future with the ease of people who were building something together even before they had named it as such. Roscoe proposed to Sadie on a November evening. He had not planned an elaborate gesture. He was not, he had told her once, a man given to elaborate gestures, and she had said she was not a woman who needed them. What he did was this. He came to her porch at sunset and he sat down in the second chair, the one she had come to think of as his, and he said, "I've been thinking about what I want the rest of my life to look like." And, she said, "And it looks like this," he said. "This porch and this view and you in that chair, I'd like it to be official. I'd like you to be my wife." Sadie looked at the late autumn hills and the orange-red light on the limestone ridges, and the pasture where Franklin was grazing in the long shadows. She thought about Thomas, and she thought about the year and a half she had spent alone, and she thought about the woman she had become in that time, hard-edged and capable and a little bit lonely, and she thought about how Roscoe had not tried to soften any of those edges, had simply worked alongside them and found them worth his time. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He took her hand and held it and did not make a speech about it, which was one of the many things she valued about him. They married in the Harlow Creek Church on the first Saturday of December, 1882. It was a small ceremony, the way they both wanted it, with Walt Brody and his wife, the pastor and his wife, Holt Drummond and 2 of the ranch hands, and old Florence Garland, who wept in a thoroughly satisfied manner through the entire thing. Pete, the young ranch hand who had helped with the barn roof, stood near the back and looked proud of himself, as though he had played a significant role in the whole enterprise. Young Pete was 18 now and had grown 3 inches since the spring and had begun paying court to the blacksmith's daughter, and Roscoe had given him frank and practical advice about this, which Pete had been grateful for. Clara, Roscoe's sister from Abilene, could not make the journey in time, but she sent a letter that arrived the week before, full of warmth and welcome, and a very detailed set of preserving recipes that she said were their mother's. Sadie read the letter twice and felt herself welcomed into a family that was small but genuine, which was exactly the kind she had always appreciated. Boyd Crane came by one more time in January to make his offer again. Sadie answered the door and told him the property was no longer available. He pressed a little, mentioned the uncertainty of the rail spur again, and Sadie told him, pleasantly but with absolute finality, that she was not interested in certain money for uncertain futures, and that she had made her decision and it was not a discussion. He left, and she closed the door, and Roscoe, who had been sitting at the table cleaning a saddle, looked up and said, "Sold him the land." "No," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to the saddle. The news about the rail spur came through in March of 1883, and it was not speculation anymore. A line was being routed through the county, and it would run along the valley floor approximately 2 miles south of Harlow Creek, close enough to increase property values significantly. Walt Brody told Roscoe on a Wednesday in town, and Roscoe told Sadie that evening, and Sadie sat with her coffee in her hands and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thomas always said this valley was worth more than people thought." Roscoe said, "He was right." She smiled. He was right about several things. The spring of 1883 was good. The winter had been mild and the ground came soft and warm out of it, and Sadie's kitchen garden expanded again, and she planted more than she had before because there were now 2 of them eating from it and 2 households to supply. Franklin had serviced 3 of the neighbors' cows and had produced good calves, which added income. The cattle operation was growing, not large but sustainable, and with Roscoe's 20 acres running alongside her 40, they were in a considerably stronger position than they had been a year earlier. In April, Sadie realized she was expecting a child. She told Roscoe on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly in the kitchen after supper, the way she told him most important things, without ceremony and without softening. He was washing his cup at the basin and he went very still, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on him before, open and overwhelmed and entirely undone. And he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her so carefully and completely that she felt something unknot in her chest that she had not known was still wound tight. "Are you happy?" she said, into his shoulder. "More than I know how to say," he said. "You are going to try to do everything for me now," she said. "I can already feel it," he laughed, a low sound against her hair. "I'm going to try," he admitted. "You're going to stop me." "Frequently," she said. "Good," he said, and held on. The pregnancy went as well as it reasonably could. Sadie was not a woman who became fragile when expecting, which surprised no one who knew her. She worked her garden and managed her cattle and did her laundry work until she was 7 months along, when she finally allowed that some of the heavier work could be redistributed, partly because the doctor in town had suggested it, and partly because Roscoe had been hovering with such barely contained concern that she took pity on him. She let him haul the heavy water and told him she was perfectly capable of telling the difference between what she needed to ask help for and what she did not. And he said he knew that, and only about 40% of his subsequent behavior reflected this acknowledgement. And she chose to view the other 60% as an expression of love rather than an assault on her competence, which was the most charitable interpretation and also the most accurate one. On a warm night in late November of 1883, in the bedroom of Sadie's house with the doctor from town in attendance and Roscoe sitting outside on the porch because he had been asked to wait there, and he was doing it very badly, the kind of doing it badly that involves standing up and sitting down repeatedly and listening to every sound from inside the house with an expression like a man being tested. Their son came into the world. He was large and loud about it, which Roscoe heard from the porch and which made him stand up from his chair so fast he nearly knocked it over. The doctor opened the door and said, "A boy, strong and healthy. Mrs. Wells is fine." Roscoe said something that he later could not recall, probably not fully coherent, and went in. Sadie was in the bed with the child in her arms, tired in the way of someone who has completed a very significant piece of work, and she looked up at him when he came in with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, exhausted and soft and entirely herself. "Come see him," she said. He came and he looked at his son, who was red-faced and indignant about the whole situation, and had a faint suggestion of dark hair and an expression that already looked, somehow, like he was making assessments, and Roscoe felt something happen in his chest that had no adequate description in any language. "He needs a name," Sadie said. They had discussed names. They had talked about Thomas for her husband and about Roscoe's father, whose name was James. They had talked about it with care and honesty, the way they talked about most things. "James Thomas Wells," Roscoe said. Sadie looked at him. "James Thomas," she repeated, and her voice was quiet and full. "Yes." They called him Jimmy from the first week, because James Thomas was a great deal of name for someone who weighed 8 pounds, and Jimmy was the kind of name a baby could grow into, and a man could grow out of only if he chose to. And James Thomas Wells showed every sign of growing in interesting directions. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's determination, and by the time he was 3 months old he had already demonstrated a remarkable capacity for getting what he wanted through pure persistence, which both parents recognized with a mixture of pride and resignation. Harlow Creek in 1884 was a town in transition. The rail spur was under active construction and would be complete by winter, and with it came surveyors and workers and the quiet, inexorable rumble of a place becoming something different from what it had been. New families were arriving, new businesses were being considered, and the conversations in front of Brody's General Store had a forward-looking quality that had not been there before. Holt Drummond was expanding his operation significantly. 3 new families had taken land in the eastern quarter of the valley. With the rail spur came better prices for cattle, because the ability to ship from a nearby loading point made the economics considerably more favorable than driving cattle to markets that were days away. Roscoe had been thinking about this carefully, and in the spring of 1884, he and Sadie sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper between them and talked about what they wanted to do with the changing landscape. The 60 acres they now effectively ran together, her 40 and his 20, were workable now but limited. The property to the south of Sadie's land, another 40 acres, had been on the market since the previous fall, the owner having taken Boyd Crane's offer and moved to Austin. "If we bought the South 40, Roscoe said, drawing the rough boundary shapes on the paper, we'd have 100 acres running from the creek bottom down to the limestone ridge. That's enough for a real operation. 50, 60 head. Good calving country in the bottom meadows." Sadie looked at the drawing. "We don't have the capital for 100 acres and the cattle to stock it. Not today," he said, "but the rail spur is going to change the prices we can get per head. And I've been talking to Drummond about a breeding arrangement. He's got good stock and he wants a share of the calves in lieu of a stud fee. We could build up over 2-3 years." She studied the paper. She did her own calculations in her head, which was where she kept her numbers, always had. "The South 40 has got that wet section near the old creek bed," she said. "We'd have to ditch that before it was usable pasture." "I know," he said. "That would be the first year's work." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had come to know well over the 2 years they had shared a fence line and a life, patient and direct. A man presenting a plan not as a thing he intended to do regardless, but as a thing he was genuinely asking her opinion on, which was still, even now, something she valued more than she could easily express. "Let's make an offer on the South 40, she said. He smiled, and she smiled, and Jimmy, who was 5 months old and lying on a blanket on the floor watching the ceiling with great interest, made a sound of what might have been editorial agreement. The South 40 was purchased in the summer of 1884. The ditching work was hard, and they did much of it themselves through the late summer and fall, with help from 2 young men from town who needed work, and whom Roscoe employed at fair wages. Sadie cooked for all of them and managed the logistics and kept the household and the older cattle operation running simultaneously, because she was still the woman who had stood in the ruins of a barn in 2 feet of snow and said she had it handled, only now handled meant something bigger. There were good days and hard days, the way there are in any true endeavor. In late summer, Franklin injured himself on a fence post and the wound went bad, and they nearly lost him, and Roscoe sat up with the bull for 2 nights while Sadie managed his fever with poultices and the cattle medicine, and whatever else she could reasonably try. Franklin recovered, which Sadie accepted as though she had fully expected nothing else, but Roscoe had seen her face when it had looked worst, and he knew the relief she felt, even if she expressed it mainly by going and doing something practical immediately afterward. Douglas, her horse, was getting old, 14 years of age now, and was semi-retired from heavy work. Roscoe had bought Sadie a new horse in the spring, a quick sorrel mare she named Harriet, and he had done it without asking, and she had looked at him with the particular expression she used when he did things without asking, which was a complicated mixture of exasperation and complete inability to stay exasperated. She had kept Harriet and kept Douglas, and both horses lived in the barn, and Douglas seemed, in his old horse way, entirely content with the arrangement. In the winter of 1884, Clara and her husband Daniel came from Abilene to visit for 2 weeks. Clara was bright and warm and immediately devoted to Jimmy, and she and Sadie took to each other with the easy confidence of 2 women who recognized quality in each other without needing extended proof. Daniel was a quiet, scholarly man who seemed genuinely happy in the West and spent a good deal of time walking Roscoe's land and asking intelligent questions about ranching. Clara told Sadie on the second day that Roscoe had written her about Sadie every month since May of the previous year, and that the letters had been thoroughly unlike any other letters Roscoe had ever written, which were usually brief and informational, whereas these had been full of detail and warmth, and what Clara called with great affection. A completely transparent attempt by my brother to describe being in love without actually using the word. Sadie stored this information away and did not tell Roscoe she knew, but she was noticeably warmer with him for several days afterward, which he noticed but could not account for, and she let him wonder about it, which was its own small pleasure. Christmas of 1884 was the best Christmas Sadie could remember. She cooked for 2 days, and Roscoe's house and her house were both full of warmth from good fires and the smell of good food. And Clara and Daniel were there, and old Florence Garland came with her husband the banker, and Walt Brody came, and young Pete came with his wife, the former blacksmith's daughter, who was a cheerful girl named Margaret, who was herself expecting in the spring. Jimmy sat in the middle of all of it, and received the attention of everyone present with a regal composure that made everyone laugh. That night, after the guests had gone and Clara and Daniel had returned to Roscoe's house where they were staying, Sadie sat on her porch with Roscoe in the cold, clear night, both of them wrapped in heavy coats, with coffee going cold in their hands, and the stars over the valley were extraordinary, the kind of sky you could only see in country where there were no electric lights, just the ancient dark and all those cold, brilliant points of fire. Roscoe said, "When I was a kid, I used to think the stars were something you had to earn. Like they'd only show you that kind of sky when things were right." Sadie leaned her head against his shoulder. "That is very philosophical for someone who spent the afternoon losing at cards to your brother-in-law." "He cheats," Roscoe said. "He does not cheat. You are not good at poker." "That's also possible," he said, and she felt him smile. They sat in the cold and the quiet, and Jimmy was asleep inside, and the cattle were settled in the barn and the pasture, and the 60 acres of their combined land was dark and still and theirs, and Sadie felt the fullness of it, the completeness of a life that had been rebuilt from grief and stubbornness and the unstoppable persistence of a cowboy who had decided she was worth showing up for. "Roscoe," she said, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For not stopping," she said. "When I told you I had it handled, when I pushed back, when I was difficult, which was most of the time." He was quiet for a moment. "You were never difficult," he said. "You were just yourself. And yourself is the most interesting and worthwhile thing I've ever had the good sense to show up for." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the starlight, and his face was the face she knew best in the world now. The angles of it, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the line of his jaw, and the way he looked at her, like she was both a challenge and a homecoming. And she thought she would not trade any of it. Not a single difficult moment or a single argument about fence posts or barn roofs or credit accounts at Brody's store. She kissed him in the starlight and the cold, and he kissed her back, and they sat on that porch until the cold drove them inside, which was later than was entirely sensible, and neither of them regretted it at all. The year 1885 came in clear and cold and purposeful. The rail spur had been completed in the December previous, and the first cattle from Harlow Creek had shipped in January to better prices than the valley had ever seen. Roscoe and Sadie now had 42 head on their 100 acres, and the operation was not large, but it was real and growing and properly managed. And Roscoe had taken on one full-time hand, a steady man of 32 named Gill, who had drifted through the county and decided to stay, and who was good with cattle and good with fences, and did not require excessive instruction. In the spring, Pete and Margaret had their baby, a boy they named Henry, and Sadie and Roscoe were named godparents, which meant something in Harlow Creek the way it meant something in small communities everywhere. A formal acknowledgement of the web of connection that held people together through bad winters and flood seasons and barn roofs that gave way under the snow. The question of whether Boyd Crane's real estate firm would try again for the land in the valley was briefly revisited when they heard from a neighbor that an agent had been sniffing around the eastern properties again. But the rail spur had changed the calculus for the landowners considerably, and the sense Sadie had always had, that this land was worth keeping, had been borne out. She gave the information the attention it deserved, which was approximately 15 minutes of consideration and one conversation with Roscoe, and they agreed that if anyone came, the answer was still no, and that was the end of it. Jimmy began walking in March, which was earlier than anyone expected, and which Roscoe took as confirmation of something about the child's character that he was not entirely sure he was prepared for. Jimmy walked the same way he had done everything, with total commitment and no concern whatsoever for the fall that inevitably followed. He fell and got up and fell and got up, and then he was walking, and then shortly thereafter he was walking very fast and then running, and the house required a level of vigilance that Sadie had not previously needed to apply to any living creature, including the cattle. Sadie found, to her own surprise, that motherhood suited her in the particular way that challenges you have prepared yourself for all your life tend to suit you. She was patient in the ways that mattered and firm in the ways that also mattered, and she did not hover, which Jimmy seemed to appreciate in the way toddlers appreciate anything, which is to say, he was entirely unaware of it but benefited from it regardless. Roscoe was a father who was present in every way, who came in from the land at midday to eat with them, and who spent evenings on the floor with Jimmy rather than at the table, who told the child stories that Sadie sometimes listened to from the kitchen with a warmth in her chest that she no longer even tried to keep contained. One evening in October of 1885, Roscoe came in from the land later than usual, having had a long conversation with a man from the county land office who had been riding the valley, and he sat at the table and said, "There is talk of a school." Sadie looked up from her mending. "In Harlow Creek. Enough children in the valley now with the new families. The county says if the community builds the building, they'll fund a teacher's position." Sadie set down her mending. Jimmy was asleep. The fire was going in the stone fireplace. "That is the best news I have heard in some time," she said. "I thought you'd think so," Roscoe said. "I told the man from the county that you'd probably be the one to organize the building committee." Sadie looked at him. "You volunteered me for that." "I mentioned that you had organizational capabilities that would be an asset," he said, with a completely straight face. She picked up her mending again. "You are going to help with the building," she said. "You and Gil both." "I assumed as much," he said, entirely contentedly. The schoolhouse was organized and built over the winter of 1885 and into the spring of 1886, a genuine community effort of the sort that Harlow Creek had not seen before on that scale. Sadie ran the organizing committee with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing complicated logistics alone since she was 27, and the building went up in good order, a proper structure with windows and a wood floor, and a pot-bellied stove, and rows of benches that 12 families had contributed to. A teacher came in the fall of 1886, a young woman from San Antonio named Miss Archer, who was 23 and thoroughly competent and immediately beloved by the children and respected by the parents. Jimmy would not be old enough for school for a few years yet, but the future had become something with a shape, something that included education and community, and all the things that made life in a hard country worthwhile rather than merely survivable. In the summer of 1886, Sadie told Roscoe she was expecting again, with the same matter-of-fact directness she had used the first time, in the kitchen after supper. He had not changed in his response, which was to go completely still and then hold her with the same careful completeness, and she had said preemptively, "I am not going to become fragile," and he had said into her hair, "I know. I love you entirely as you are." The second child came in February of 1887, during a cold snap that kept the world very still and white, and this time Roscoe had been told in advance that he was welcome to stay in the house, in the next room, rather than on the porch, which he had accepted with considerable relief. Their daughter came into the world considerably more composedly than Jimmy had, quiet and observant, which the doctor said was unusual, and which Roscoe and Sadie both took as evidence of a particular kind of personality. They named her Eleanor Me Wells, Alina for Sadie's mother, me because it was plain and pretty, and Roscoe said the combination had a dignity to it that seemed to suit her already. Jimmy, who was 3 years old and had been staying with Walt Brody and his wife while all this happened, was brought home the next morning and introduced to his sister with the appropriate ceremony. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked at Roscoe and said, with the absolute conviction of a 3-year-old, "She is very small." "She'll get bigger," Roscoe told him. "Like Franklin?" Jimmy asked, because Franklin the bull was his primary reference for something growing large over time. "Not quite like Franklin," Roscoe said, and managed to say it with total seriousness. Alina did get bigger, and she did it with the same quiet determination she had brought to her arrival. She was a different child from Jimmy in nearly every respect. Where he was loud, she was thoughtful. Where he charged forward, she observed, and then moved with precision. And they adored each other in the way of siblings who are genuinely different and genuinely bonded, which is the best kind of sibling relationship there is. They grew up running on 100 acres of Texas land, between two houses that were, in practical terms, one household, knowing the names of the cattle and the proper way to treat a fence post, and how to read the weather coming off the limestone ridges, and why you planted companion crops together in the garden. Harlow Creek continued to grow, slowly but genuinely. The rail spur brought commerce, and the school brought permanence, and the combination brought the particular quality of a place becoming itself, finding the shape of what it was going to be. The injustices of the era were not invisible in that valley. There were Tejano families who had been working land in the county for generations before the Anglo settlers arrived, who had seen their holdings contracted by legal maneuvers and boundary disputes. And Sadie had seen enough of the world to know an injustice when she encountered one, and she said so in the ways available to a woman in 1887, which were limited but not nothing. She spoke in favor of the Ray's family who had a land dispute with one of the newer landowners, and Roscoe testified honestly about the boundary markers, and the matter was settled in the Ray's family's favor by the county judge, who was, on balance, a fair man. It was a small thing. The injustices were large and many, and the small things were not adequate to them. But Sadie and Roscoe both believed consistently in the value of the small things, and they acted accordingly. Douglas, the old horse, died in the fall of 1887 at the age of 16, quietly in his stall on a cool morning. Sadie found him and stood with him for a long time, and Roscoe did not try to rush her or redirect her, just stood beside her in the barn with his hand at her back while she said goodbye to the last direct physical connection to Thomas, the horse who had been there for all of it, for the dream and the grief and the rebuilding. She did not cry in the barn. She cried that night in the dark, and Roscoe held her and did not say anything, just let her, and she was grateful for the silence as much as the holding. She said after a while, "He was a very good horse." "He was," Roscoe said. "Thomas would have hated to know I kept him all those years after he threw him." "Maybe," Roscoe said. "Or maybe he would have understood." She was quiet. "Yes," she said, "he would have understood." By 1888, the Wells operation was running 60 head, had 3 hired hands including Gill, and was contributing meaningfully to the local economy through the rail spur. Sadie had retired the laundry work when Jimmy was born, and had not missed it except as an abstract point of pride, and she had replaced that income several times over through the kitchen garden, which had expanded into a genuine market garden, selling produce to the general store and directly to families in town, and through a small sideline in preserved goods that she had developed after Clara sent those preserving recipes. She sold her preserves at the general store and through word of mouth, and had more orders than she could always fill, which she considered an extremely satisfying problem to have. Roscoe's house and Sadie's house had been effectively merged through a covered walkway built the previous summer, a practical acknowledgement of what had been true in practice for years, that these were not 2 separate households but one household organized across 2 structures, with the kitchen and the family rooms in Sadie's house, and the sleeping rooms and Roscoe's study in his. It was a peculiar arrangement that delighted Florence Garland when she heard about it, and that suited the Wells family entirely. On a June evening in 1888, 6 years after the barn roof came down in an April snowstorm, Roscoe and Sadie sat on the porch in the long evening light. Jimmy was 5 now, and was somewhere in the west pasture with Gil, who had taken on the role of mentor to the boy with a gruff affection that neither of them ever directly acknowledged. Eleanor, who was a year and a half old, was asleep inside. The sky was the particular deep gold of a Texas summer evening, and the limestone ridges were pink-orange against it, and the 100 acres of their land spread out before them, the cattle grazing, the kitchen garden in full season, the barn with its good solid roof, and somewhere in the east field, barely visible from the porch, the simple wooden marker at Thomas's grave, which Sadie tended every spring with wildflowers, because she was a woman who honored what had come before without being trapped by it. Sadie looked at all of it and felt the weight and the warmth of it, the impossible fullness of a life that had been built from the ruins of another, board by board and season by season and argument by argument, and one stubborn cowboy who had kept coming back regardless of what she said, who had loved her exactly as she was and had never once suggested she ought to be different. "Roscoe," she said. "Do you remember standing in the wreckage of my barn and telling me I needed help with it?" "I said you needed help," he said. "I didn't say you needed me specifically. That is a very fine distinction. I thought so at the time." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and the evening light was in his dark eyes and in the silver that was beginning at his temples, which she found disproportionately attractive and had told him so, which he had found disproportionately pleasing. "I never thanked you for that," she said. "You have thanked me," he said. "Not for that specifically, for standing in the barn and just saying it, plainly, not trying to pity me or manage me or make me feel small, just noting a fact." He considered this. "It was a fact," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." He reached across and took her hand, the way he had reached across between their horses on that June evening 4 years ago, and held it with the same ease, as though holding her hand was the most natural thing he had ever done, which was because it was. "I was never going to stop coming by," he said. "You should know that, even if you told me to go to the devil every Saturday for 2 years. "I nearly did," she said. "I know, I had a plan for that scenario," she laughed. "What was the plan?" "Come back Sunday instead of Saturday," he said, entirely seriously. She laughed again, that unguarded laugh, and leaned her head back and looked at the sky, and Roscoe squeezed her hand and watched the cattle in the long evening light, and Jimmy came running up from the west pasture with grass stains on his knees and some extremely complicated story about a rabbit that had to be heard immediately. And Eleanor woke up inside and called out in the wordless way of small children who want to know where everyone is. And Sadie stood up to go get her, and Roscoe stood up too. And they went in together, and the porch was empty in the evening light, and the 100 acres lay quiet and full in theirs, and the barn stood solid against the sky, its roof good and strong. Built to last. Years later, when Jimmy was grown and Eleanor was grown, and the Wells Ranch had become one of the steadiest and most respected operations in the county, people who had known them from the beginning would sometimes remark on the particular quality of the Wells family, a kind of quiet capability combined with an equally quiet devotion that showed in everything they did, in the way the land was kept, and the way they spoke to each other, and the way they showed up for their neighbors when it was needed. Pete, grown old in the county with Margaret and their 3 children, told the story of the barn roof sometimes, how he had been 17 and been brought out to help fix a widow's barn, and how he had watched Roscoe Wells work all day without stopping and bring food for the return trip, and never once make the woman feel beholden, and how the whole thing had struck him even then, at 17, as the most straightforward and determined kind of love he had ever seen. He said that what he had learned from watching Roscoe was that love was not something you declared and waited on. It was something you showed up for, with timber and tools, on the Saturday mornings when you had not been invited, and the problem was clear, and the person who needed help was too proud to say so. And Sadie, when she heard this story repeated back to her in her later years, said only that Pete had got it mostly right, but that what he had missed was the part where she had told Roscoe she had it handled, and that she had meant it, and that she had been right, and that the point was not that she had needed him to rescue her. The point was that he had never tried to. He had just come with timber because the timber was spare and the need was there, and he had kept coming back, because he had decided she was worth showing up for, and because she had decided, eventually, that letting someone show up was not the same as admitting you could not stand alone. It was, she said, a distinction that had taken her some time to make, but that she was very glad she had made it. The evening star came up over the limestone ridge, and the kitchen light burned in the window, and somewhere in the house their voices were the voices of people who had built something real together and knew it. And outside, the land was good, and the fence lines were sound, and the barn roof held against whatever weather came. It always held.